I still remember the day I moved into Cedar Hollow like it was yesterday, not because it was special, but because it felt like finally breathing after years of noise and deadlines. I was 35, a remote software consultant, burned out from city life, and I bought this 1.3-acre property just outside a small lake community in northern Michigan. Nothing fancy, just trees, a gravel driveway, and a quiet kind of emptiness that I thought I needed. The deed was long and boring like all deeds are, but there was one clause that the seller mentioned almost casually, something about a shared septic access easement that ran across the back edge of my land, connected to 6 luxury lake homes built a few years earlier. And I remember asking him if that was going to be a problem, and he just shrugged and said it only mattered for maintenance, nothing else. So I said fine, signed the papers. And honestly, I did not think about it again for months, until people started treating my land like it was not mine at all. At first it was small things, a stray trash bag near the gate, then another, then construction debris like broken trim boards and paint buckets, and I told myself maybe it was coincidence, maybe wind, maybe animals, but deep down I knew that was not true, because every Sunday it got worse. I would wake up, make coffee, look out the kitchen window, and see more bags stacked near the old fence line like someone had quietly decided my property was the community dump. I sent an email to the HOA contact I found online, polite, calm, almost overly respectful. I wrote that I believe there might be a misunderstanding about property boundaries and asked them to stop placing waste on my land. No response. A week passed, then 2, then 3. I sent another message, then another, and by the 3rd attempt I started to feel something shift inside me. Not anger yet, more like disbelief that people could just ignore another human being so completely when you are literally standing on their property line. The turning point started with a name, Carter Ellison, the new HOA president, a man I had only seen once driving past in a black SUV like he owned the whole shoreline. His house was one of those modern lakefront builds with glass walls and perfect landscaping that looked more like a resort than a home. And after he took over, everything escalated. It was not random anymore, it was organized. I would see neighbors walking down the access path that crossed my land, carrying garbage bags, sometimes laughing, sometimes not even looking in my direction like I was just part of the scenery. One morning I walked out there and counted 12 bags, all placed neatly near my gate like a scheduled delivery. I stood there holding my coffee cup, watching it, and I remember thinking this is not misunderstanding anymore. This is a decision. I tried one last time to keep it calm. I drove over to the HOA office building, a small renovated cabin near the marina, and I asked to speak with Carter. They told me he was busy. I waited anyway. Almost an hour, until he finally came out. He looked at me like I was interrupting something important. I said very calmly that trash was being dumped on my land, and it needed to stop. He smiled a little like I had said something naive, and said you live next to a shared system. We all use the land around here when needed. I said that is not what the deed says, and his smile faded just slightly, just enough for me to notice. He replied quietly, "Then maybe you should read your deed again," and walked back inside before I could answer. That night I sat at my desk for hours reading every line of my property documents, highlighting, cross-checking, until I found it. The easement only allowed emergency septic maintenance access. Nothing about storage, nothing about dumping, nothing about routine passage for waste disposal. And that was the moment everything changed, not because I wanted revenge or conflict, but because I finally understood something simple. They were not confused. They were taking advantage. Over the next few days, I started documenting everything. I installed a small camera near the gate. I took time-stamped photos every morning. I recorded license plates when I could. And I even called a county surveyor to confirm the exact boundary lines. When the surveyor came out, he walked the perimeter slowly, looked at the stakes, looked back at me, and said, "Yeah, this is your land. No question about it." I remember feeling this strange calm after that, like the situation had finally become real in a way I could respond to. I built an 8-foot chain-link gate reinforced with concrete blocks, not aggressive, just final. And I put up a simple sign that said private property access by owner permission only. Then I locked it. I did not send another email. I did not call anyone. I just waited. And I did not have to wait long, because 2 days later at exactly 9 in the morning I heard engines outside my window. And when I stepped onto the porch I saw something I did not expect. Several neighbors gathered near the gate, standing like they were confused, And Carter Ellison was at the front, arms crossed, staring at the locked entrance like it had personally insulted him. He did not look angry at first, just puzzled, like something he assumed would always be available had suddenly stopped obeying him. And when he saw me standing there with my coffee, he called out in a voice that tried to sound casual, but did not quite make it. He said, "You really locked this." And I remember taking a slow sip before answering, because something in me had already shifted too. I said, "Yes, I did." And that was the moment everything started to break open, because behind him, somewhere out of sight, I could already hear the early signs of what happens when a system built on quiet entitlement suddenly stops working. But I did not know yet just how far they were willing to go or how badly this would escalate before it was over, and I just stood there watching him, realizing this was no longer about trash on my land. It was about control, and neither of us were backing down now. I remember the exact second everything stopped feeling like a small neighborhood problem and started feeling like a system collapsing in real time. Because when Carter Ellison stood there on the other side of my locked gate, the smile was gone completely now, replaced with something tighter, more controlled, like he was trying to hold back frustration in front of the others watching behind him. And he said again, slower this time, "You really locked this access point." And I just nodded, still holding my coffee like this was some normal morning. And I told him, "Yes, it is my property, and access is by permission only now." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to, because the truth had already done the work for me. And that is when the first crack appeared in their confidence. Not loud, not dramatic, just a shift in posture, a hesitation. Like a group of people realizing for the first time that the thing they had been walking over for months might actually push back. Carter stepped closer to the gate and said, "You are disrupting emergency septic access for 6 households." And I remember laughing a little, not because it was funny, but because of how carefully he was framing something illegal as something urgent and noble. And I said, "Emergency access is fine, Carter, but dumping construction waste and household trash is not." And I have photos, timestamps, and GPS data for every single incident. And when I said that, I watched one of the homeowners behind him look away, just slightly, like they were suddenly aware of being seen instead of invisible. Carter's jaw tightened, and he said, "We have been using that route for years without issue." And I said, "No, you have been using it without consequence. That is different." And there was a silence after that, not long, but heavy enough that I could hear the wind through the trees behind us. Then he tried a different angle, softer this time, almost reasonable, saying, "Look, we can work something out. Just open the gate and we'll clean everything up." And I shook my head because I already knew that pattern. Once access is granted without terms, it never comes back with respect attached. And I told him I am willing to discuss terms, but not under pressure at my own gate. And I closed the conversation right there and walked back inside. And I thought that would be the end of it for the day, but I was wrong, because by that afternoon the tone of everything changed, and I started getting calls, not from Carter, but from unknown numbers. Then a voicemail from someone claiming to be a county liaison, then another from a lawyer's office, and I sat at my desk listening to them one after another, feeling this strange mix of annoyance and clarity. Because now it was no longer neighbors dumping trash. Now it was institutions getting involved, or pretending to. And that night, I pulled out everything again: deed, easement language, survey maps, and I highlighted the same sentence over and over until it almost blurred into nothing: emergency septic maintenance access only. And I realized how much weight those few words carried when people tried to stretch them beyond meaning. The next morning, I was surprised to see a county inspection truck parked near the road, and a man in a reflective vest walking slowly toward the gate. Not rushed, not aggressive, just observant. Like he had seen situations like this before and already knew how they usually ended. I walked out to meet him, and he introduced himself as a sanitation compliance inspector, and I showed him everything before he even asked: the photos, the timeline, the boundary survey. And I watched his expression change gradually from routine boredom to something more serious. And after about 20 minutes, he nodded and said quietly, "This is not permitted use of easement land." And that was the first official confirmation that what I had been saying for weeks was not just my interpretation, it was fact. He told me he would be issuing citations and escalating it to the county board because the septic system serving those homes was now considered compromised due to restricted access. And when he left, I just stood there for a while in the driveway thinking about how quickly polite emails had turned into official reports and financial consequences. But what I did not know yet was that this was the moment everything started accelerating beyond anyone's control. Because within 48 hours, the neighborhood was no longer just annoyed. It was panicking. I saw cars coming and going all day, people arguing near the shoreline, one couple dragging suitcases into their trunk like they had already made a decision to leave. And then Carter showed up again, but this time he was alone, no group behind him, no confident posture, just a man standing in front of a locked gate that he could no longer ignore. And when I stepped outside, he did not start with anger this time. He started with exhaustion. He said people are getting fines, thousands per house, and the system is backing up. And I looked at him for a moment and said, this is what happens when you treat someone's property like it is invisible. And he flinched slightly at that word invisible, because that was exactly what they had been doing. And then he did something I did not expect. He lowered his voice and said, what do you want? Just tell me. And I remember feeling the weight of that question, because it was no longer about proving a point. It was about what comes after proof. And I told him I want formal written access terms, compensation for unauthorized use, and guaranteed respect of property boundaries going forward. And he laughed once, but it was hollow, not confident, and said, you are serious. And I said, I have never been more serious in my life. And for the first time, he did not argue. He just stood there looking at the gate like it had become something permanent that he could not talk his way through anymore. And that night I got a call from his attorney, and the tone was completely different from every message before it, slower, careful, almost respectful. And he said we may need to find a structured agreement. And I remember sitting back in my chair realizing that the balance had fully shifted, not because I had won anything yet, but because they finally understood they could not simply ignore me anymore. And outside my window the lake was completely still, like nothing had happened at all. But I knew better now, because this was only the middle, and the real consequences had not even fully arrived yet. I remember waking up that morning with a strange kind of stillness in my chest. Not peace exactly. More like the air after a storm has already passed but the ground is still wet, and you know something irreversible has happened even if the sky looks normal again. And for the first time in months there were no trash bags at the gate, no footsteps cutting across my land, no cars idling like they owned the place, just silence. And that silence was louder than everything that came before it. I made coffee like usual, stood by the kitchen window like I always did, and I kept expecting something to change that quiet back into chaos. But it did not. And around noon the envelope arrived. Thick paper, official seals, multiple signatures, the kind of document that does not shout, but still feels heavier than anything physical. I opened it slowly at the kitchen table, reading line by line. And what I saw was exactly what I already knew was coming. Because once lawyers and counties get involved, emotion disappears, and everything becomes structure, liability, enforcement, cost allocation, access rights. And I leaned back in my chair for a moment, just listening to the house around me. The refrigerator hum, the wind outside, the faint creak of wood settling. And I thought about how something as simple as a strip of land can suddenly become the center of 6 households realizing they built their comfort on something they never actually controlled. By mid-afternoon, Carter Ellison came back. But this time there was no group, no neighbors behind him, no performance. Just him walking up the driveway alone like the weight of everything had finally stripped away whatever image he was trying to maintain. I did not stop him at the gate this time. I opened it, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but because at that point the gate itself was no longer a barrier. It was just a formality. And I watched him step onto my property slowly like he was entering a space he had only recently been told he needed permission to exist in. And when he reached me, he did not start with excuses. He started with exhaustion. He said quietly, we need to resolve this in a way that does not collapse everything. And I remember looking at him for a moment thinking how interesting it is when people finally discover consequences only after they stop being optional. And I said it already is resolved. Carter, we are just deciding the terms of reality now. And that phrase hung between us longer than I expected, because that was really what the whole thing had become, not conflict anymore, but definition, what access means, what ownership means, what respect means when it is no longer assumed. Over the next several days, everything shifted into a different world, not confrontation but negotiation, not anger but documentation. Attorneys replaced neighbors, emails replaced arguments, and every sentence now had legal weight attached to it. The county sent a formal notice confirming that the septic access restriction created compliance violations for all connected properties, and suddenly the same people who had ignored me for months were now extremely interested in resolution timelines. I still remember one conference call where Carter tried to argue that the situation was unfair, that property values were being damaged, and there was a long pause on the line before I responded because I wanted him to hear it clearly. And I said, what you are calling damage is just the cost of ignoring boundaries. And nobody spoke after that for a few seconds, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing left that did not sound like avoidance. The settlement process took about a week to finalize, though it felt longer because everything was so precise. Access rights were rewritten into formal terms. Compensation was established for continued use of my land. Maintenance responsibilities were assigned to the 6 households. Penalties were clearly defined for any unauthorized dumping or misuse. And every clause reflected something very simple that had been missing from the beginning: accountability. And when the final signatures were placed, there was no celebration, no dramatic moment, just a quiet confirmation that the rules everyone had been bending finally had edges again. After that, things changed in ways that were almost boring, which is how you know it actually worked. No more trash near my gate. No more shortcuts across my property. Maintenance crews came when scheduled, and for the first time since I moved there, my land actually felt like it was being treated as something that existed on paper and in reality at the same time. Carter and I never became anything close to friends, and I never expected we would. But there was a final moment a few weeks later when he passed by while I was outside, and he gave a small nod, not friendly, not hostile, just acknowledgement, like two people who had seen the same system break and then rebuild itself under pressure. And after he left, I stood there for a while thinking about how none of this started as a fight. It started as small disrespect repeated until it became normal, and that is what people underestimate the most: how quickly normal becomes permanent if nobody interrupts it. And I still think about that sometimes when the lake is quiet and the wind moves through the trees, because nothing about this story is really about winning. It is about the moment you decide whether your boundaries are real or just suggestions. And I learned that once you decide they are real, everything around you eventually has to adjust, one way or another. And if I am honest, that is the part one never forget. Not the conflict, not the settlement, but the silence after it all finally stops testing you.